The military, compromised by the white nationalists, have actively engaged in fraudulent experiments with the manipulation of targets, which generates the diseases which are exponentially spread, including the position of nerve hacking and other bioeffective poisons, which actively are manipulated in order to generate the net result. So, in practice, it's a matter of literally being overpowered, which manufactures the sending or reproduction of signals which have been copied and pasted in order to afflict the general public with the amusement of the insurrectionist KKK contracts for the insurrectionists from the Civil War position of engaging in California's uh, protection of surveillance functions or the non-punishment of the same offense in a different way or at a slightly different location, changing the smallest minute aspect of it suddenly becomes no longer criminalized as an objective by their fraud as color of law and color of office, as California has been overthrown by the white nationalists and is used as a platform to overthrow the other states as a specific rejection of the constitutional republic and all of its agreements, which generates the systematic treason side effects of distributing the black market, which is cornered markets by their insurrectionist fundings without congressional power of the purse, which manufactures their ability to fund themselves against the United States interests, and the act of not challenging them with checks and balances and compelling absolute force against the insurrectionists is an activating and abetting the insurrection. At which point, the childish position of an older brother holding a younger brother's hand and slapping them and saying, "Stop hitting yourself," is functionally what they're doing. High school kids calling each other gay is basically what they're doing, except you exponentially have more powers from the military equipment in order to actively spread the function of intelligence actions for the KKK contracts, such as the sheriffs using the stingrays for the active incremental reduction of liberty by the systematic increasing of the criminal activities uh, used in the excess to their legal offices limitations, which engages in the systematic harassment by the terrorist operation. At which point these military operations, such as the ones approved of by Lindsey Graham, are functional wizard communism, which is centrally planned economy as they systematically dismantle the systems of the legal barriers to retaliations in violent engagements on nonviolent contests, which facilitates the police position of getting um, targets on lesser offenses as they're systematically removed. Now, as you engage in the terrorism and subversions where they actively should have been protecting them against, forcing them into the artificial vulnerability, which generates their ability to be captured by those inferior infractions, which are not inferior infractions, as they are the criminal intention of the wizards in question, generates the position of their criminal escapades, which cannot be stopped unless you arrest the rat bastards in charge of the Wizard Communism. At which point, the intelligence agencies not being properly arrested and dealt with prevents the possibility of ever solving these problems, at which point your complaint about defunding the police and then the increase of crime is an actual offense by the terrorists who are creating the police to become dangerous, at which point um, it's a false flag. They're playing both sides of it. And the act of playing both sides of it requires you to arrest or deal with appropriately by removing these felons from the government in order to actually substantively get any ground on that. At which point, it doesn't matter how much California invests into its homeless population, By virtue of not arresting the KKK contract operators, you are de facto guaranteeing the injury permanently. And without removing the core problem, which is the insurrectionist terrorists, um, there's no investment that you could do that is anything except for money laundering. At which point you have these systems of the charities and whatnot, which act as a money laundering system for RICO violations, which generates the position where they are actively cooperating with the KKK contract operators in unison and not being able to stop the terrorist operations or have any interest in stopping the terrorist operations. The active ingestion of receiving the funds for compensation of reducing the criminal injury to the victims manufactures the perpetual cycling of resources by the defrauding of the public in non-solutions. At which point you have the system of the woke, which are manufacturing racism from the liberal side, which is manufactured from the white nationalist side, as the white nationalists are the ones in charge of the KKK contract in the violation of constitutional rights, at which point the guarantee of the white nationalist interest through the other side or the other denomination of Druids guarantees the predetermined negotiated answer by the wizards, which facilitates their ability to socially engineer the intended damages for the communism to assert the winners and the losers as is chosen by the centralized power. And many of these white nationalists, communists, conduct operations like Stephen Molyneux's reference to the act of terrorizing people in order to get them to leave locations without the use of due process or service of law or any competent functions, which is by definition what California is doing in order to destabilize their enemies, which are the American law abiding citizens. At which point you have the systems of them actively using sheriffs and other traitors to go in, destroy property, block AC, turn off water, basically make life as uncomfortable as possible in order to reduce the human decency, in order to coerce compliance with the movie, which is basically the technique that they used against the Indians for the Trail of Tears, or the active things that they've done against the Jews and the things that they've done against the black community. These are all historically normal functions of the KKK, and those contracts were substantively acquiring results into changing the face and form and substance of the structure of how society is constructed, which generates substantive changes, which requires the obligation to uncensor the secret functions and out these faggots, which generates the ability to engage in the investigation against the Nazi functions and those who cooperated on the left because of your Marxist delusions are actively committing suicide. You're going to be betrayed by these Nazis. They're going to betray you. They did it the first time. They're going to do it now. You cannot trust them to do anything but be themselves. You can't trust a snake to not be a snake. You can't trust a scorpion to not be a scorpion. You cannot trust these psychopaths to be anything but themselves. They're unredeemable, mindless evil, and that's the only way that you could understand exactly what's going to happen to you as you cooperate with them. They're going to make you vulnerable, and they're going to betray you, and they're going to destroy you with contempt for you on the basis of your willingness to become vulnerable to their insurrections, which requires the active exchanges, which accelerates the violence between each of the groups as it exponentially compounds in the Druid function where they conduct the elections of wizard democracy. If there is an inability to make the settlement on which Druid should be in control, it becomes a violent civil war, as they are violent psychopaths, as the fundamental basis of their core identity. And the diverse factions uh, of their religious psychopathy is not substantively changing the position. It's basically just like a bunch of different denominations of churches which are engaged in these arrangements, except if you engage in their inability to negotiate and you turn them into what these terrorists are, you become the violent version, the radicalization version of the oppressive false morality, which is the active subjugation of the removing of the right to liberty, the right to life, and the right to pursue your own happiness, which generates the position of the violation of the person, the papers, and their effects. And without your right to a person, paper, or effects, you can't stop the government from enacting against violence against your body under the false secrecy, which is not a power delegated to them, facilitating the ability to permanently receive injuries without uh, remedy, which generates the militant factions against each other, as it is an arms accelerant between all of the denominations of the Druid psychopaths in every direction. At which point, by playing their game, you are committing suicide. You don't have an alternative way to substantively understand this in a way that allows you to become safe because you know that they're dangerous. Stop lying to yourself. You understand functionally that your life is in danger because they exist. And playing their stupid game so that you could use their equipment and shoot their guns is an act of suicide. They're going to beat you and they're going to kill you. The solution is not violence. Stop using their equipment, stop using their tactics, stop being a dumbass and cooperating with their mind games, stop following their spells, stop mirroring their actions. Start endorsing, dare I say, law. Dare I say, investigate them. Dare I say, compel discovery. Dare I say, do not give them the clouding of secrecy. Do not give them the sound of silence. Do not give them the capacity to cover for their offenses. Do not protect them from their violations. Find them, arrest them, process the information correctly, and calculate the actual competent due diligence in a reasonable and competent mechanism, and give up your fucking insanity in thinking that there is any advantage in your suicide. It is a fundamental component of the United States to be allowed your day in court under a fair process with discovery and due process, and the act of withholding evidence is a subversion of due process. At which point, the engagement of not compelling their release of the secrets, which substantively changes the results, is an act of a hate crime. You're just using the government to do hate crimes. It's a KKK contract to do terrorism in the subversion of the public. They don't even have the argument that it's national security because the primary contenders, which they would point to as aggressive, already know about the equipment. They already have intelligence sharing with those nations. And already having the intelligence sharing with those nations, the ones you would be concerned about already know it. They already brag with each other, they already cooperate with each other. You are the sucker by not compelling them into the public. If they're going to use the equipment on the public, if they're going to use an operation on the public, they have to release the information. The position of protecting sources and methods is fraud, as it was specifically designed to counter David Bull's character from the estimate, which they acquire through terrorism, bills of attainder, and ex post facto in their insurrectionist frauds, as they independently operate outside of the legal process, verified by their wizards, which are double agents who acquired position by voter fraud and other mechanisms of subversion, which generates the systematic insurrection of the Confederacy as a separate nation at war with the Americans, which, viewing this as a war, have to be restrained under public threat policy, which creates the position that their military action, viewing the American civilian population or republic as the enemy, has to be treated with contempt and receive the barring, receive the restraints of law enforcement, receive the limitations that should have been put on them from the very beginning. And their contempt for the Constitution is the renouncing of the right to the office, which requires them to disengage as the function of agents, as they are not serving their office, at which point they must be disarmed, the secrets must be released, and it must be processed, as it does not serve any American function to not have the public aware of what's happening against the public. It does not serve a national security function, as anyone you would perceive as an enemy is in fact already aware of its existence and actively conducts the manipulation under these arrangements, at which point there is no substantive argument for the fraudulent secrets except for the fact that it is a terrorist contract in the destruction of the United States to compel violations of all rights for the manufacturing of a centralized planned economy and structure of society, to compelled neo-feudalism as they systematically destroyed the United States in favor of arbitrary anarchy. Now, the position with the Satanists is that the inability to repent generates their position of they need to be able to do whatever it is they want arbitrarily without restraints as a natural component, as their obligation to their baser desires and have the power in order to enforce them through the corruption generates the protections for the mechanisms of unlimited variation of evil. Now, in Revelation, when it says that the harlot who rode the beast drank the blood of the Satans and her sins reached to the sky, is the basis of this absolute power with arbitrary engagements, as the entire black market is their desired position of the unlimited dangers to the general public as it becomes an anti-human oppressive system, as they are systematically manufacturing the results of the hyper poor and the hyper rich in order to accelerate the false assumption of their superiority, in order to reinforce their arrogance as internally justifiable by the fact that they are not being stopped. They are proved in their theory to themselves that they are superior. Without checks and balances and a remedy to a secret, you have arbitrary subjugation to white nationalist terrorism. You have your sundown towns, which are exponentially compounded and increased. As you give them footholds, they will exponentially increase their exterminations of any challenges, at which point you have your manufactured communisms for the white nationalists who are going to destroy everyone. Fingerprints, forensics, lie detector tests, these have all been used systematically in order to peddle fraud, which is the fundamental objective of the KK contracts by the double agents inside the law enforcement and other operations from the military, which have historically been used time and time again as fraud, as even when they knew that it was substantively wrong, they continued to use it as it was desirable for them to reach their conviction rates for their slave raids, which is fundamentally their objective. Now, the manufacture of these slave raids is the assertion that you do not have any rights at all under the system because they, as Confederates, are not American, and thus, as an enemy of the United States, would not adhere to the limitations and subjugations of their enemy of war. Scalia's threat in favor of the Confederate insurrection says that those who are detained, who are being abused in order as a retaliation or a punishment for not complying with speaking to whatever the abuser is who has them confined, is not a legal punishment. And he's correct, it's not a legal punishment, it's an act as an individual. And that act as an individual is not functioning as the office. And the refusal to function as the office is the renouncing of all protections of that office, which is directly what he was arguing against. The function of his insurrection and hatred for the white nationalist opponents to them generates the threat to the United States by them, the white nationalists, who, by virtue of holding them, do not have the civil rights at all, including the right to the Fifth, the right to not incriminate yourself, the right to not talk to them. Having removed that right, as they are not captured by any American, is systematically the peddling of fraud for their insurrection under Lindsey Graham's white nationalist position of incorporating military techniques to engage in their war against the American, obstructing contracts and freezing assets so that there cannot be a legal remedy is functional sedition by obstruction of the courts, which is sedition. And the function of doing that is foundationally their objective position, as the general public not having proper representation by barring of the resources to do the nonviolent contest in subjugation and service to law is the direct opposition to those who are not serving the law inside the government as insurrectionist traitors. The unlimited fraud, masking whatever they want for whatever reason, including their distribution of the black market, which is the amoral position of just acquiring funds without the power of the purse, is basically the position. Now, in the Soviet Union, the light blue helmets understood the function of the wizard spell, which generates the position of absolute, pure, contemptible, arbitrary force, at which point, whenever it was used against them, they just gave up because there is no functional argument that exists against somebody else wanting to use violence against you. It is, was, and will continue to be exclusively, unredeemably terrorism by legal definition. They are insurrectionist terrorists, insurgent terrorists, double agents, religious radicals, psychopaths, morons. Now, the position of their unprofessional military of engaging in raiding of the general public in favor of the distribution of their alternative resources generates the system of weakness by their inability to be competently functioning in society, subsidized by their terrorism. The exchange is not the lesser of two evils under law. The subject is law or not law, at which point the exchanges of which illegal abuse they conduct against you is a non-negotiated position. You do not have a right to any of the violations, period, the end. At which point the full releasing of the information and the correction, including the punishments and settlements owed to the victims, has to be conducted in good faith by the observing of the obstructed information for the systems of due process, which under the original American system, under their obstruction, has the protection of law enforcement combined with the position of the investigation of private suits in a collaborative function, as the position of law being the great equalizer is not the great equalizer if the government does not equally defend the poor victim as much as the rich victim. The rich victim has money and they can pay for the suits, and the poor victim cannot. At which point the absolute catastrophic position of the terrorism is the removing of their assets, is the freezing of their accounts, so that even if they would have legally been able to have afforded the lawyers, they cannot, is inso facto um, the insurrection against the process, which generates the catastrophic damages as it requires the education which is actively being tampered with, as they're systematically reducing the capability of the general public to be able to engage in these functions of standard minimum um, abilities to engage in the faculties of the American justice system, which would have been necessary for any argument of equality under law, which is essential to the American constitutional republic. Cooperating with the terrorists is inadequate, as even if you tell them the truth, it's not functionally going to be what they want to hear, as what they want to hear is their internal justification to the public of their straw man, which validates whatever it is they wanted arbitrarily, which manufactures the results of what has to happen, as the legal process, as is discovered in Tripoli, is that you cannot negotiate with terrorists. And so you cannot negotiate with terrorists generates the position of non-cooperation with the insurrectionist bastards by refusing to talk to them, by refusing to engage in the collaboration with the correct answers. Um, there is no advantage in speaking with them. At which point, the act of their extortions or the act of manipulation of the straw man of whatever they want, which is the engagement of the wizard spell, which is the engagement of using their words instead of the American colloquially understood words, which generates the separation of the two logics, which manufactures consent and materializes artificial guilt where there was no criminal intention, generating the position to justify the existence of the white nationalist insurrection, such as the white nationalist position that white women shouldn't want to have sex with black men when they overthrew North Carolina's government because it was elected to have black men instead, as the white nationalist terrorist force, which the judges want to argue is the actual authority inside the United States, that we are run by terrorists, that we are run by mobsters, that we are run by crime, is the system of having overthrown the constitutional republic, which means they, having sworn to the United States constitutional republic, are in violation of their own oath and disbarred themselves from that office, compelling the obligation of replacing them with those who would have conducted the agency's function instead of the active obstruction for the enemy. What you need to understand is the functional psychology of their insurrectionist position is fundamentally weak. There was a guy who named two kids winner and loser, and as time went on, winner, time after time after time after time, his name was winner. Every time he engaged in this, you had a fragile mind with zero resistance, and he systematically got into trouble and it became a convict or whatever, and actively got into trouble after trouble after trouble after trouble, and lost after loss after loss after loss. And you have the systematic position of the other child, the loser, who, having been called loser his entire life, had the active resistance and actively made something of his life against the onslaught of the position of those taking the cheap shots at him. I believe he went into law enforcement or something. I think it was the FBI or something. But basically, these systems of hyper success and hyper losing is reinforced by the communists as the retaliation of the fragility is only substantive under the position of those who are underneath them. Those who are underneath them have to suffer their title, and those who are not underneath them do not have to suffer their title. At which point, when the rain, when it rains, it storms, and the catastrophic event of the communism of protecting the secrets of these unredeemable KKK contract psychopaths is an active suicide. They're unredeemable, mindless buffoons. And the active investment into the military industrial education complex is the act of actively dismantling your capability of existing in the real world. As you become too stupid to exist, you will cease to exist. And if you view William Barr's pre-crime policies as anything but their fragility into the insurrection against the system, then you are unredeemably incompetent. And their systems of their terrorisms, of their unjustified punishments, for unlimited variation of injury against the victims is the collection into the military industrial education system, which generates the false experiments, which generates the punishments and harassments and injuries in various ways, such as their poisoning of vaccines or their engaging of infecting targets with various diseases such as syphilis or herpes or AIDS or any of these other affairs, which they are doing and actively fighting for and protecting under the fraudulent claim of secrecy in order to subvert the American structure in favor of the white nationalists, as they are unredeemably systematically racist in their insurrections in favor of their centrally planned economy and society, which is hate crimes in every variation as a standard policy of norms, as that is their concept of their identity, is to do unlimited injury without cause because who they are. Now apply that to dirty tricks. So the target having the resources has those resources frozen, goes to lunch, and is fraudulent processed by the collaboration as having robbed them when the person having paid for the engagement has paid for it from the resources owed to them. The engagement of being able to keep control over the accounting of those frozen assets should have not been withheld under these systems. Now, under the legal system, even a POW has to be allowed the existence of the human decency against these extortions, at which point the existence of those accounts being obstructed is the obligation of the government to pay from the obstructed accounts and funded by the obstructed contracts or value owed to them withstanding. At which point the extortions against them by the taking without the payment of the taking generates the theft by the double agents inside the government for the white nationalist operations, fraudulently manipulating the results of the free market. They are collapsing the financial structure beyond the specific targets into the collective position to everyone being catastrophically the target. At which point, this is an everyone deal. And the only real solution is American justice. The only solution is the revealing of the key information necessary in order to conduct the processes of the compulsions of the necessary agents in order to manufacture the procedure as is prescribed by American law without the obstructions or subversions or ex post factos or bills of attainders or false permissions of terrorism. At which point the obstruction from the records inside these specific cases uh, refer to the high priority targets, such as David Bowles, as top ranking general inside the United States military for intelligence oversight, in charge of the military police function, engaging against the violations of the intelligence community and other of the excesses of the government, as the violation through the rape culture is systematically something that he would have specific control over as a legal character, which would facilitate the initiation of the primary moving functions necessary. At which point, the process of going through all of the agents in order to release the other agents, in order to release the other agents, in order to release the other functions, systematically compound on each other as they were systematically removed by the treason, sedition, and high crimes of the white nationalist insurrectionists who, viewing themselves as an enemy of the United States, systematically bar or freeze or hold or contempt the systems of America from being able to exist in practice, manufacturing the artificial results through the fraudulent documents, which must be barred and thrown out as they are systematically not tolerable under American law, compelling the existence of the restoration of David into this position in order to make the rest of the refined process product, which generates American law and actual competent, stable safety for the American people in their persons, their papers, and their effects. Otherwise, you will lose your control of your persons, and they can do whatever the fuck they want to you arbitrarily because they are not and have never been Americans. Now, the obstruction of the system from using its correct faculties in order to engage in the censorship against the courts is obstruction of justice and contempt for court, at which point the manufactured results are disqualified under law as they are and have always been insurrection. They are blocking the correct resources, which are even publicly available, from being organized correctly under the original faculties, as the censorship is the removing of the faculties from being able to have communicated to the original viewers in the original way, under the original value, for the original agreement, for the distribution and dissemination of the information necessary to national security, which is their enemy. Their fraudulent excusing of human trafficking is an exponential, catastrophic threat, which is arresting and detaining without due process, which is a specific violation of their fundamental restraints necessary for them to claim to be an agent of the United States or its allies. Those delaying for their arbitrary crimes generates their catastrophic conclusion, at which point the position that there is no ability to stop them before, during, or after any of their operations is the acknowledgement of the white nationalist terrorism against the general public under the use of the criminal subversion intelligence function of secrecy, generating the natural conclusion that they are provably substantively changing the market of the targeted communities, at which point the unhoused are legitimately unhoused. The impoverished are legitimately stolen from in order to become poor, at which point the freezing of their accounts by having stolen the resources is the substance of them owing the account instead of the target, at which point their taking over of the liability in that position makes them the ones who have to pay for the lunch or the dinner or the mansion or etc., as it is specifically their crimes which is the exclusive responsibility of the obstruction of the economy, and their attack against the economy is an act of war against the function of the United States superiority in historic standards, at which point the United States economy, being the thing that establishes it in the world, is the thing being directly assaulted, is a direct attack at the highest levels of the highest functions of the highest value of the United States, which is treason against the United States ability to engage in national security. The economy is the national security. If we cannot trust in the good faith of the government to pay its debts, then we cannot survive as a system, let alone gain our historic hegemony around the world, which is necessary to our American functions, as specifically reminded historically, time after time again, in their excuses for the expansions of government powers, for the ingestion of increasing resources, at which point they do not have an argument. Their argument has already been made, and their argument is that they must comply under their own definitions, which they have submitted for the resources. They love lies, and they are at war with anyone who tells the truth. At which point you have to systematically understand that the insurance structure that David would have given with his deals with the former Soviet Union and its guaranteed collapse, under their own projections from the risk assessment functions, was actively subverted by George Soros and Jeffrey Sachs, which, having engaged in investments with them when they took down the Iron Curtain, was specifically designed to oppress and collapse their economy by the systems of their expertise frauds, which have historically been used against the targeted communities, as they are refined processes with specific conclusions, which required the absence of David's security in order to gauge in the injury. It's the same thing with the special operation of the war in Ukraine. These were specific reactions to the absence of the risk management process.